Welcome to the Critical Christian podcast, where we answer difficult
questions
about the Bible with questionable answers. We're your hosts, Dan and Justin.
I'm Dan.
I'm Justin. Right. Today we're in Genesis 6. We're going to be talking about the Nephilim, the sons of God, and possibly much more.
I call it the Nephilim.
Nephilim?
Yeah.
How do you know if it's Im or Im?
I don't.
We'll get there.
Okay.
All right. Without further ado, let's jump into Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 7.
All right. When human beings began to increase in number on the earth, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. The Lord saw how great the wickedness of the human race had become on the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time. The Lord regretted that he had made human beings on the earth, and his heart was deeply troubled. So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground, for I regret that I have made them."
Thank you for that.
You're very welcome.
What were the first questions that we wanted to address with Genesis, the first part of Genesis 6? I know there's going to be a lot of questions that come from this, but...
One of the first ones is just, all right, we mentioned before how you don't think the first 11 chapters of Genesis are real.
I mean, factual to history? Like, do they match what we find in the historical record?
Yeah, I guess you could say that. I mean, you've also said that a lot of them are just mirrors or parallels to previous mythological stories, what have you like that. And so if that's the case, then I guess we don't even need to discuss this because it's just fake. However, going on the assumption, obviously there's reasons even if it's fake, but we'll go on the assumption that it's real for now, okay? Why is it even included? You know?
What purpose does it serve?
Right. Yeah.
That's a really good question. I think the first thing we would want to do is consider the audience. Mm-hmm. Who is the audience here, do you think?
I don't know. I guess it depends on who is writing it. Right?
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Okay. Well, I think this portion of the text is difficult because I think we all know the story of Noah, which we're not quite to yet.
Right.
We can see that the story of Noah kind of has a purpose within the biblical text. We know what it's kind of used for. But this interlude with the angels seems to be less explanatory, and it almost seems to be an intrusion into the narrative, right?
Yes.
It doesn't seem to serve much of a purpose. But there are snippets within the biblical text that reference this event.
Yeah, I was going to mention that too.
Yeah.
There's even one in Numbers, which is, I assume it's a factual book. We presume it is, at least, right?
Yeah, I would classify Numbers as historical.
So why in the world would they reference something from Genesis that is not historical?
Yeah, what verse and chapter is it? 1333?
Yes, it is.
All right, let's do Numbers 1333.
1331.
1331. Yeah, go for it.
But the men who had gone up with him said, "We can't attack those people. They are stronger than we are." Of course, this is when the Israelites were going to Canaan because it was supposed to be, their land?
Well, they were supposed to be taking over the land.
Right.
Yeah.
But then they saw all these giants and they're like, I ain't doing that. So anyhow, and they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land they had explored. They said, "The land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Enoch come from the Nephilim. We seem like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we look the same to them." Now, I know there's a lot to be said just about the descendants of Enoch, but...
Right. Yeah. Well, the descendants of Enoch has some biblical connotations and some extra biblical connotations.
Okay.
If you're familiar with the Anunnaki, which have been featured quite a bit in like Ancient Aliens.
Of course, I have no idea.
And other ancient Near Eastern mythology. We're gonna get to the Anunnaki.
Okay.
They play a role here.
All right.
But for now, let's stick to the very first section.
Mm-hmm.
What possible application could this be where it talks about people coming to multiply on the face of the earth, and then the sons of God, assuming at this point where sons of God are angelic beings or heavenly beings?
Right. Well, at least divine, right?
Divine beings, perhaps maybe even the counsel of God.
No, divine doesn't mean good, right?
Yeah, that's a very good point. Being divine beings doesn't necessarily make them good. As we can see even from parts of the biblical narrative, it seems like there are some wicked heavenly beings. Mm. But there are possible interpretations for this, other than the fact that they were heavenly beings. Are you aware of the line of Seth theory?
I am not. Wait, Seth, he was the one that was born to take over for Abel, right?
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So in this theory, the sons of God are referring to the children born of Seth. So they would essentially be the good lineage, the non-wicked lineage, because they were untainted by the sin of Cain.
Oh, okay.
So we would see the biblical narrative sort of setting up Cain and his lineage as being wicked, and Seth and his lineage being
okay,
sort of the chosen. The problem with this, though, is that it appears that the sons of Seth would have all been wiped out in the flood.
Oh yeah, right.
If we assume, though, that Noah is a son of Seth, then I guess it could make some sense. But there's a bunch of context in which the sons of God show up that are inexplicable.
Mm-hmm.
So, for example, in Psalm 89, Psalm 82, Job 1. Job 1 is a striking example. Let's check out Job 1, where the sons of God basically come to meet.
I didn't know that there were so many references to this, actually.
There's quite a bit. Let me list them real quick. We don't need to hit all of them tonight, but some of the Old Testament references are Job 1, 6 through 7, 2, 1 through 2, 38, 5 through 7, and then Deuteronomy 32, 8, Psalm 29, Psalm 82, Psalm 89, Psalm 88, but only in the Greek Septuagint, and then Daniel 3:25, although this passage is not in Hebrew, it's in Aramaic, but still worth taking a look at. For our purposes, though, let's grab Job 1, 6 through 7.
Let's see, 6 through 7.
One day, now this is interesting, the NRSV says the heavenly beings, but there is a note here.
Yeah.
And I'm sure the note, says sons of God. One day the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and the accuser, this is Satan, Hasatan in Hebrew, also came among them. The Lord said to Satan, "Where have you come from?" Satan answered the Lord, "From going to and fro on the earth, from walking up and down on it." So this is kind of an interesting scenario here where it appears as though the sons of God include Satan.
Mm-hmm.
So here Satan is among the sons of God.
Okay.
So it would seem to me to interpret the sons of God as being of the mortal descendants of Seth could never fit this scenario.
I mean, it just says he came with them or came among them.
Sure. But even if we assume at this point that Satan is separate from the sons of God, meaning is it kind of an indirect reference, the sons of God came, but Satan also came with them.
Yeah.
it would seem odd to me that the mortal descendants of Seth are approaching God.
Yeah, this is true, isn't it?
Right. Yeah. So that's a hard one to fit. And then also, let's check out 38, 5 through 7. So Job 38, 5 through 7. This is God speaking now to Job. He's actually reprimanding Job here. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone? When the morning stars sang together, and all the heavenly beings, it actually says sons of God, shouted for joy. When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. We could have gone a little bit back in this passage, just referring to the creation of the earth.
Okay.
So who was around at the creation of the earth when God laid out its measurements, designed it, put it together?
So there were beings that were there before humans.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah, so the sons of God, at a minimum, seemed like they would have to predate the mortal humans that we read about, right? Let's also check out Psalm 89 and 82.
Okay.
Here I think we get a picture of the sons of God filling in more of a role of the divine council or the divine assembly.
Okay.
However, in Psalm 82, it seems as though there's a number of these children of God that have acted wickedly, right? God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. How long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Then a pause, Selah. Give justice to the weak and to the orphan. Maintain the right of the lowly and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk around in darkness. All the foundations of the earth are shaken. I say, you are gods, children of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, you shall die like mortals and fall like any prince. Rise up, O God, judge the earth, for all the nations belong to you. And this is interesting, too, because in the Hebrew Old Testament, we hear that the nations were divided and numbered according to the sons of God, the 70 sons of God.
That's why, and this is probably a tangent, but that's why I kind of believe that back in those days, God, the God, was watching over Israel, and then let's say lesser gods, or the sons of God, or the heavenly beings, or in the heavenly council, they had dominion over these other cities or what have you.
Yeah, exactly, and that fits the Old Testament narrative that the nations were essentially governed and put into the governorship of the various sons of God, but it would seem as though that they didn't perform the way God had expected.
Right.
And so here God is reprimanding them and even making a distinction that, you guys are God, but you're going to die just like mortals.
Yeah.
So again, it seems like assuming the sons of Seth theory, it just doesn't really fit with some of the references we see about the sons of God.
I agree with that.
We could go more into some of the possible theories. There's another theory that was common where the sons of God is referring to mortal people that were born of royal status, so like princes.
Okay.
And there's a way to justify that using one or two verses where human beings were referred to as Elohim. So there's one point where it said that Moses will be like an Elohim.
Oh.
And there's another chapter where I believe Samuel is referred to as an Elohim. But this particular theory, it doesn't hold a lot of weight. A lot of scholars have abandoned it a long time ago. And currently, from what I know, the best theory is the one that's been proposed by most of the modern scholarship, which is these are essentially the children of God, angelic beings, divine beings.
So just another tangent. Why are they called like Elohim? You know, why are they compared to him?
Right, because they're his children.
Oh, that was it.
Yeah. Well, have you ever said you ever see a friend of yours who has kids?
Mm-hmm.
Let's say, for example,
oh, you're just like your father.
You're
right?
you're just like your father.
Yeah.
You might say like, if you saw my son, like, hey, I saw little Justin today.
Yeah.
Right. Well, even though his name's not Justin,
right.
the fact that he's mine, he came from me. He's like a mini me of sorts.
Yeah, I get that.
So the Elohim, the epithet could necessarily refer to the offspring of El. Right. But back to the purpose
right.
that some of this serves, is it, to me, it looks like it's setting up a reason for the flood.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So there's going to be more to it that we'll be able to touch on later. But right now, I think the purpose of this is to set up the flood narrative. One of the questions I had, though, was why the daughters of mortals?
Mm-hmm.
Were there no female angels, no female divine beings that would have suited the need?
I don't know. I mean, I thought angels were like asexual or something, you know?
It would,
right? Then again, Michael. I mean, here's the thing: how many angels in the Bible have female names? None. None.
That's a great question. I can't think of any.
Right. So maybe they are all men.
Right.
You know, I mean, not to be sexist, but you know, we had Michael, Gabriel, Raphael. Is that one?
Leonardo, Michelangelo. What are the other Ninja Turtles?
Those are the ones.
I think those are ones.
Donatello.
Yeah. Donatello,
right.
of course. Yeah.
But yeah, I've never heard of a female angel.
That is a really good question that I didn't consider, is whether or not there were actual females for them to mate with. Maybe that's what makes the most sense of the story, is that these were males with, say, some pent-up sexual aggression and no outlet for it.
Maybe.
And you make a very good point, too, because the New Testament, Jesus specifically states that they will not marry or take in marriage as though they do on the earth anymore once the new heaven and new earth is established. So that's really interesting. It's a really interesting thought. I think that makes sense of the question, too, is why they were after the daughters of God. It's not that they were somewhat superior or differentiated. It might be that they were just the only choice. That's very good. I like that. One of the next questions along that line, though, is in which way did they copulate with the women? Right. And I think perhaps they would have to have bodies. I think that's a given, right?
Sounds likely.
I don't know if that's something that needs justified, but
I mean, the angels always had bodies.
Right.
In the Bible, right?
Yeah.
I mean, wasn't there a story of
Lot?
Yeah, two of them coming and they looked just like regular people or something like that.
Well, they looked like regular people, but apparently attractive ones, because the people of Sodom wanted to, have their way with them. Yeah. And then there was 3 that visited with Abraham and Sarah. In fact, they even ate with them. Oh. So to say that they have
ate with them.
Yeah, they broke bread with Abraham.
Ate.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
It would seem to me that this is a real physical manifestation, similar to the way we would think Jesus was manifested on the earth, right? So the fact that they had bodies doesn't seem to be in conflict, that I can tell.
Right.
Yeah, okay. Now, the difficulty here with having sex between the daughters of man and the children of God is, how is it evil? I mean, why? Why is it evil, right?
I don't know. That sounds pretty obvious to me.
I mean, the text assumes that we know it's bad.
Right.
But why? What makes it bad?
You asking me?
I'm asking you, because I don't know the answer.
Just because, heavenly beings aren't supposed to get it on with humans. I mean, I feel like that's just obvious. I don't know.
Yeah.
Just seems wrong.
Okay.
I don't know. I mean, it's an abomination, isn't it? You know? Right?
I think
it's
maybe
it's not how he intended, probably.
Well, I definitely think that's correct.
Okay.
I think maybe the word I'm looking for is like a defilement.
Defilement.
Especially with the angelic beings, you would expect them to be undefiled by let's just say the sexual act for most ancient cultures was considered to be somewhat dirty.
Right.
Even though it was necessary, they had to do it, and it was well regarded within marriage. Once you were married, a lot of people would say it no longer dirty. But it would seem here that the angels did, we'll say, marry the women, perhaps. It doesn't really say, but it says take.
Yeah.
That's usually marriage language, when you take a woman.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Well, maybe.
Anyways, it seems to me that maybe what you were saying holds some water, so it wasn't the way God had designed it. And then perhaps secondly, it was a defilement of the heavenly beings. And this works a little bit with cosmology. You know, the ancient Near Eastern cosmology believed that the realm of the heavens were the realm of the deities, partially because it was pure and untainted by the dirt of the ground and the human flesh, and it was necessarily clean, right? So it made a fitting abode for the deities. All right, before we move to verse 3, Dan, are any further questions we should address here?
Yeah, so there's this thing called original sin, right?
Oh, yeah.
But
yeah.
what if the Nephilim were actually responsible for corrupting humanity?
As though Satan being part of
Well, yeah.
the people group here.
Yeah.
But do you think that they played a part in it? Maybe they helped plan it? Satan didn't act alone. He had accomplices?
Yeah, presume so.
That's an interesting thought.
Maybe.
Well, it would certainly seem possible. We see in Job, Satan appears before the Lord among the sons of God. Perhaps a number of them operated together, colluded with each other.
Right.
Yeah, certainly a thought.
Yeah, because I mean, doesn't it talk about when Satan was cast out, a bunch of other angels went with him? Right.
I mean, what talks about that?
I don't know, the Bible somewhere, I presume. You know, when God cast him out of heaven, you know?
Well, there's a verse in Isaiah and a verse in Ezekiel that most people believe sort of alludes to the casting out of Satan. But I would personally argue that has nothing to do with Satan.
Oh.
And that's another topic. We won't have time for that today.
No, we don't have time for many topics.
Jesus does reference, he says, I saw Satan fall from heaven like lightning.
Okay.
So he does kind of reference that mythology a little bit. But other than that, I think most of what we know about the fall of Satan or Satan being cast down comes from extra-biblical literature.
Okay.
So say something like the Book of Enoch, which...
That's interesting.
To be fair, is really important to the New Testament church. And there's a lot of concepts in the New Testament that don't show up in the Old Testament, but they do show up in the Book of Enoch. When we think of things like the Son of Man and some of the messianic expectations for the Son of Man, all these things are spelled out very well in the Book of Enoch, but they don't show up in the Old Testament. So that's certainly something that we'll need to address when the time comes for it. The Book of Enoch is going to play a big role, though, in demonology, angelology, that type of thing. Yeah. Let's move on to 6:3. Then the Lord said, My spirit shall not strive with man forever, because he also is flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. So I thought a couple things are interesting here. 120 seems like a very drastic decrease from what they were before, right? I mean, some of the kings, if you look at like the Sumerian king list, hundreds of years, just like some of the early biblical patriarchs, hundreds of years, being cut down to, a magnitude of 1/10 or even less. It seems awfully drastic. Is there a reason for this?
Well, if I had to guess, I'd say they're just trying to explain our short lives, Like, I don't know if this actually happened or not,
Right.
I mean, I know that earlier we were talking about other cultures having stories of, long, beings that lived a long time, right? And so they were just trying to explain why that's not how it is anymore.
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. In fact, let's grab real quick the Sumerian king list, because it's pretty accessible. We don't have to read the whole thing, but I do think that it's helpful. So some of the years.
Where is this from?
The Sumerian king list? Well, it's from Sumer.
Like, not in the Bible.
Oh, no, this is not part of the Bible.
You see that it says somebody ruled for 20,800 years?
Yeah, so it says, after the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. In Eridu, Elulim, that's a tough one. Elulim became king. He ruled for 28,800 years. Elalgar ruled for 36,000 years. Two kings, they ruled for 64,800 years. And so on and so forth. It's going to list a series of kings before the flood.
Well, that's just ridiculous at that point, huh?
I mean, 18,000 years here, 21,000 years here.
Right.
5 cities, 8 kings ruled for 385,200 years.
So what is this again?
Then the flood swept over. This is the Sumerian king list.
So this is history?
Well, it's their version of history.
Right.
And it says here, after the flood swept over and the kingship had descended from heaven, the kingship was in Kish. In Kish, Geshur became king. He ruled for 1,200 years. Kulasini, Bel ruled for 900 years. Gangish Lishma ruled for 1,200 years, and the next ruler for 20, then 300, then 800, then 900, and so on and so forth. As the rulers carry on, the numbers appear after the flood, at least, to not be anywhere near as long, even though there's a couple of them in here that are still quite long, like Masada ruled for 840 years. So it's intriguing that the earliest rulers lived for so long.
Right.
However, there is a mathematical explanation for this.
Okay.
And this is recent.
Okay.
So when I was a young man and I first learned about the Sumerian king list, there wasn't a whole lot of answers for how to resolve these large numbers. But somebody who specializes in Sumerian translation and Sumerian math figured out that it appears the earliest list, the kings from before the flood, the way that the numbers were written out were different. So you need to drop the 2 zeros at the end of the number.
Okay.
So then the first king ended up...
Is there a reason for that?
There is a reason for that. I don't know Sumerian, so I will not even try to give an explanation.
Okay.
All right. But there's a clear way that the numbers here were written that are different than the way the numbers were written after the flood. So the language shifts.
Mm-hmm.
But if you take the years here, you get 288 for the first king, then 360, then 648. Now, what becomes interesting, when you knock off the 2 zeros, all of the kings who lived before the flood, just like the kings who lived after the flood, those numbers now become divisible in the base 60 system, which is what everything was.
Okay.
Everything was divisible by 6 and 12 and 24 and so on and so forth. So by adjusting these numbers and knocking off the 2 zeros, it would appear that the numbers now start to make sense. They're roughly the same length as the people after the flood.
Okay.
What's interesting, though, is in the Bible,
right,
there's really no explanation for the long lifespan. It appears that the numbers in the Bible we take absolutely at face value. So a lot of people would say, well, the narrative that was written for the pre-flood patriarchs, people that lived before the flood, it was generally believed that they lived long because of the legends based out of the Sumerian culture and the surrounding cultures, that the earliest human beings lived for a very, very, very long time.
okay,
So it's possible that the Sumerian king list is actually so old that by the time the Hebrew Old Testament was being written, they had already lost the ability to translate those numbers. They've been lost to oral history, and they got lost in a way in which the numbers were ridiculously huge. And they just didn't have access to the same translation technology that we have access today to be able to figure out the math problem.
Well, that's crazy.
So basically what would happen then is people have suggested that the Old Testament basically has enshrined a numerical system that was a mathematical mistake because they didn't know any better. I'm not a Sumerianologist,
Right.
so I can't critique the view.
I'm sure there's only 2 of them in the world.
There's not a ton of them. Nevertheless, that's...
But here's the thing.
Mm-hmm.
But it did say that after the flood, they were only going to live 120 years, right?
Right.
So why does this the Sumerian thing seem to contradict that? Right?
Well, yeah. So that's the thing. So at first glance, if you assume that all the numbers in the Sumerian king list are at face value,
right,
then it's not a contradiction. They live for thousands of years, and then after the flood, they live for hundreds of years. Whereas in the Old Testament, before the flood, they lived for hundreds of years.
Okay.
And then after the flood, they lived for a max of 120.
Let me see that.
So it's still a pretty drastic decrease.
Yeah, I gotta see that again, huh?
So, yeah, back at the Sumerian king list, first king was 28,000, 36,000, 64,000, 43,000, 108,000 for just for 3 rulers.
Right.
But then after the flood, we see a lot of the kings 900, 420, 300.
Okay, 420. What does that mean? You'd only take off 1 0?
No. What I'm suggesting here is the numbers for the rulers that are pre-flood, the way they are recorded, all right, is numerically different than the way that the numbers were recorded after the flood.
Okay.
And so they need to be computed and or translated differently than the numbers that were recorded after the flood in the Sumerian king list. So when you account for the translation, then there actually is not a large discrepancy in the years between or before the flood and after the flood. The theory is that the ancient Hebrews didn't know that. They didn't understand how to translate the difference of years before and after. And it's possible that even the Sumerians didn't know. Maybe the pre-flood list was incredibly ancient, and by the time they wrote the post-flood list, they had lost some of the information on how to properly translate those numbers.
All right, I'm sorry, but these are all still more than 120 years, right? Am I reading this wrong?
I think you're missing the point.
The
point is that according to the Sumerians and according to the Hebrews, or at bare minimum, according to the Hebrews, with a misunderstanding of the Sumerian, people before the flood lived way longer than people after the flood.
Okay.
And so the reason why the Sumerian king list becomes important is because a lot of people believe that it is a piece of archaeology that supports the theory of the Old Testament that before the flood, people lived longer. Then after the flood, they lived shorter. And the reason why this supports that is because it appears to say the same thing. People lived much longer and then much shorter.
Yeah, but I thought Methuselah, it doesn't say in the Bible he was the oldest living person, and that was 969, so that doesn't even hit these big numbers.
Oh, no, we're close. I'm not saying the numbers are comparable.
Okay.
No one's saying that.
Okay.
Don't hear what I'm not saying. Hear what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that people believe the Sumerian king list supports the theory that people lived longer before the flood.
Okay.
I'm not saying that the numbers correlate with each other.
Okay. All right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So, nevertheless, 120.
120.
It seems drastically shorter than, the hundreds of years. I had a theory about the 120.
Okay.
I think 120 was picked out of a hat based on what people generally would consider the longest living person to be at that time period. Mm-hmm. If you looked around at the time that Genesis was written, you would be hard-pressed to find somebody that's older than 120.
Right.
But you knew of these legends. Well, I know about these legends that have been passed down through our family, through the culture, that these patriarchs lived for hundreds of years. So how do we justify the fact that the people we know now just don't live that long?
Right, okay.
In fact, the people who live now seem to barely live over 100. Mm-hmm. Well, the answer to that is, because God limited the lifespan to 120.
So they were trying to make up an excuse for something that they thought was true that they may not have needed to make up an excuse for because it was just another story.
Right. If you're of the mindset that we're still talking about a mythological reading, then certainly, this would be an explanation for something that it seems to be true. This is the explanation for that thing.
Okay.
This is how we make sense of it.
I think I finally get it.
Of course, as we've said before, it could all just be true.
Right.
We don't have to assume it's a mythology. That's just my position.
Right.
All right, I think it's time that we need to talk about the Nephilim.
Oh, we've been talking about them.
I think you mean the children of God.
They're the same thing.
Well, but they're not?
Okay.
All right, let's carry on. Let's read Genesis 6:4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Those were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown. All right, so the Nephilim, there's theories. We've got some theories to hit here.
Okay.
The Nephilim could be, as you said, the children of God.
Right.
Maybe.
Okay.
They could be the offspring of the children of God and the mortal women, so they would be demigods.
Oh.
Right?
Okay. Like Hercules.
Yeah. And then there's a third theory that the Nephilim are actually the disembodied spirits of the demigods produced by the union of the deities and the mortal women.
I don't even know what that means. So I'm going to guess that's not the right one.
I don't think that's great, and the reason why is because I think the disembodied spirit of the great rulers were probably referred to as the Raphaim.
Okay.
And they do show up. In fact, the text, I want to say in Isaiah, that speaks about the king, which is, everyone thinks is talking about Satan, speaks of the Rephaim.
Okay.
In fact, maybe it would be beneficial just to grab that passage real quick. All right, so in Isaiah 14:9, we read about a really interesting passage. It says, Sheol below is excited about you, to meet you when you come. It stirs the spirits of the dead for you, all the leaders of the earth. It rises all the kings of the nations from their thrones. Interestingly here, that's not exactly what it says.
Okay.
It says it stirs the spirit of the dead for you, but in the text it actually uses the word Raphaim. In Hebrew, it says all the dead, the chief ones of the earth.
Mm-hmm.
So there seems to be a connection here between the dead rulers of the earth that are now in Sheol, the disembodied spirits of the great rulers. So it's thought here that perhaps the Nephilim are the Raphaim, the dead. If we assume that the Nephilim, the offspring of the sons of God and women, produce these great rulers, which is a kind of a prevailing theory, the men of renown.
Right.
Then when they pass, when they die like mortals, their spirits become the Raphaim.
Oh. I get it. I don't think that's the case, but I get it.
Right. So that's the theory.
Okay. That's weird.
Nevertheless, the Nephilim, it appears, I think, just on the face of the text to maybe be the offspring of the angels and the women, right?
Yeah, I'm going to go with that one.
Yeah. Certainly, it could be. It could also refer to the angels themselves, and here's the reasoning behind that: is because the root word of Nephilim is just Hebrew for the fallen ones.
Oh.
Well, who are the fallen ones?
Right. I thought the angels that followed Satan.
Right. So if we go on the plain meaning of the word Nephilim, it would seem that possibly the fallen angels are the Nephilim, not necessarily the offspring of those angels.
Oh.
So yeah, there's some choices that need to be made there as to who they actually are.
I guess that doesn't really matter that much, though, right? I
mean,
if they're the angels or the offspring of angels, they're still not good, apparently.
Well, I guess the question would be whether or not the Nephilim were completely divine beings, or if they were partially divine, partially mortal beings.
Okay.
Right. That's the question at hand.
That makes sense. I don't know. I assumed they were partially mortal, which is why they were going to die. But
that's my thought.
Okay.
Yeah, but again, we're kind of buttressed with Psalm 82, where God sits among the children of God and says, "Though you are gods, you will die like men," which is really interesting. So that would seem to support the idea that the Nephilim were in fact the children of God and not the offspring of the children of God.
Oh.
Right.
So this is their punishment.
Right.
And so it doesn't even matter what the children are doing.
Right.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So it's interesting here, too, in Genesis 6, we actually read that the Nephilim were giants. So in the Greek version, which was translated a couple hundred years before Jesus, Hebrew into Greek, it literally says the giants instead of the Nephilim. So even some of the Hebrew translators who knew Greek at that time, their own teaching would have been that the Nephilim were the giants, the men of renown, the offspring of the union of the angels and the women.
Okay, so we do think it is the offspring then, the children.
It seems that way, and it also shows up in an interesting passage in. You already talked about the sons of Enoch.
Well, a little bit. I'd like to get more into it though.
Right.
Like who was Enoch?
Right. Yeah. Who was Enoch? Well,
yeah.
That's a great question because there's a race of divine beings. I would refer to them as the children of God.
Okay.
But in Babylonian mythology, they were the Anunnaki. And they were called the Anunnaki because they were the children of Anu and Ki.
Okay.
So those were the male and the female head deities. So the offspring of Anu and Ki were the Anunnaki, and there were 70 of them. And there's a whole mythology about them too, about how they committed, evil deeds.
And what?
So it's interesting here that these giants,
Mhm.
in the report, when they scope out the promised land, and they bring back the report of why they can't attack,
Uh-huh.
because there were giants in the land,
Right.
the sons of Anak.
Mhm.
It seems to me that there's some mythology about the giant offspring, the demigods descendant from the Anunnaki.
Okay. Yeah. I'm confused, but that's okay.
All right, so on the same vein of identifying the Nephilim, I think now would be a good time to look back at Numbers 13:33.
Mhm.
And this is a report of what happened, or what they saw when they scoped out the land. So we saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. And here we see the same root word in Hebrew for the Nephilim, the fallen ones, the descendants of Anak. So it would seem here that there seems to be a correlation between the Nephilim and them being the sons of Anak.
Mhm.
Or could we perhaps assume that Anak is a reference to the mythological deity that created the Anunnaki? So Anu would be the official name.
Does that sound likely?
I'm not sure. The sons of Anak show up in the Old Testament in a number of places,
Okay.
but it's ambiguous. There's always talk about the sons of Anak without a lot of identification. I think we read a little bit in the book of Judges about some actual people descendant from an actual human being named Anak,
Oh, okay.
but there seems to be no mythological connotation to it.
Right.
But here in Numbers 13:33, it almost seems as though they're trying to make a connection with the idea of the Nephilim and the Anunnaki being somehow related to each other within mythology.
Oh.
But even so, it is just intriguing here that the Israelites recognize that there are human beings, demigods, referred to as Nephilim,
Uh-huh.
which would definitely support the idea that the Nephilim were the offspring of the deities that came to the earth.
And we're real.
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah. If there's a question at all about whether or not the Old Testament supports this as being factual, I think the question is yes. The Old Testament certainly supports the Nephilim as being a real thing. This doesn't appear to be like an imagery that you have, or like an analogy you have to figure out.
Right.
This is a real thing. In fact, it was so ingrained in Hebrew culture, the book of Enoch the first book of Enoch spends the majority of its time discussing the fall of the angels and who the Nephilim are, why they were in trouble, what their task was, how they were.
Then we should just read that and get all our answers.
Yeah, I mean, maybe next week we do a dive into the book of Enoch.
Yeah.
And the only caveat is the book of Enoch, was written in the, post-exile period, probably 350 to 300, maybe even 200 BC. So we're talking about over 1,000 years different, most likely, in the time of writing.
Okay.
And it would seem that the book of Enoch, the purpose of the book of Enoch was to fill in the gaps of information about who the Nephilim were.
Yeah.
Right? Because a lot of people at that time would have had the Bible and knew about it, but maybe not had the answers.
Right. So either it was written as fiction to answer the questions, or it was some sort of oral history.
Oh, that's likely. Yeah, that's certainly possible.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which would explain why it was written down a lot later, but had information from earlier. I don't
Absolutely.
know. Okay.
Well, it sounds to me like next week we should take a look at Enoch.
We could do that.
Before we jump into the flood.
All right. Yeah.
Yeah. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Any other concluding thoughts or questions about the Nephilim?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, there's still so many, unanswered questions about them, right?
Right.
But hopefully we'll get to them.
Yeah, like I think the Old Testament assumes that we know some of them too, like Goliath.
Oh.
Or the King Og.
I don't know who that is.
Oh. Well, I mean, some of the foes that Israel fights against as they're taking the Promised Land appear to be descendants of the Nephilim.
Huh.
And they even talk about King Og, about how tall he was and how large his bed had to have been.
Okay.
And then the same thing with Goliath. They really emphasize his size, and if it's not clear in the text, it's at least implied that he's an offspring of the Nephilim, which would account for his great size and mightiness.
And when was David and Goliath? When was that written?
I'm not sure when it was written, but the time period in which it records, is roughly 1000 BC, 900 BC.
Okay.
Now, it's certainly possible that the stories of David and his time period were written roughly the same time as Genesis. To be sure, we don't have any accounts of what happened in Genesis in a language from the time period. They're all written from certainly later date. So either the original copies didn't survive, or they were oral traditions that were written down later.
Yeah.
Or a combination of both.
Yeah, I don't know how long it took, but it took a while for them to get written language, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, just from the beginning of time, I guess, to,
Well, even when the stories were written down, how many people could even read them?
Right.
I mean, there's only probably a handful of scrolls that they could have went to, or a handful of tablets that could have been read. So it's not as though, even though they had writing technology, it's not as though it was actually accessible to the common person. Everything was still done orally. Yeah.
It's a lot of details to, get completely right, going orally for 1,000 years, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, quite a bit.
Yeah. I don't know.
But the stories, they were important to the culture, important enough that they were even featured in the New Testament.
The Nephilim?
Yeah, the Nephilim, the fallen angels, yeah. In 2 Peter 2, 4-6, and Jude 5-7, two New Testament authors speak about this event.
And
even 1 Corinthians 11 actually mentions it, only kind of glancingly, but...
And maybe Genesis doesn't have much historical documentation to prove it's real or whatever, but you would say the New Testament does, right?
Yeah, I mean, the New Testament is really accounted for well in the archaeological record. Of course, that doesn't mean that we can account for everything in the stories. Okay. So, if we find information that a particular location existed, or even a particular house with someone's name on it that was prominent within the New Testament text, we can only confirm that the person existed, and maybe even where they existed, that it might correlate with the text, but we can't necessarily confirm that they did the events recorded about them.
No, I get that, but at the very least it should help some people to believe Genesis a little more, right?
Yeah, I think...
Or at least parts of it, at least the Nephilim.
I think, depending on your view overall of Scripture, if you're an inerrantist, or if you're, a biblical minimalist on the other end, I think the fact that the New Testament authors believe these things to be true should carry some weight. Right. So,
especially the things that Jesus references.
Yeah, you would think if Jesus references something as
it's got to be true,
historical.
Yeah.
Then you would want to think that it's accurate. The hard thing is that there are sometimes ambiguous statements where Jesus mentions the Old Testament text, but doesn't really, the way he mentions it doesn't really tell you if he believes the events were factual,
Great,
or if it was a theological statement about the text. You know what I mean?
Not really.
Oh. Well, I mean, if Jesus says something, about Adam and Eve, does that mean that he believes the story of Adam and Eve happened as a factual basis, or is he just referring to a common imagery that other people recognize and can tap into,
Right.
and they understand that he's referring to a theological concept?
Yeah, right.
As opposed to historical.
But of course, we weren't there, so we wouldn't know the difference, right?
Yeah, that's the hard thing is, we're always looking back, trying to understand what happened in the past. And that's difficult for us because we lack tools.
Right. But apparently we keep discovering new things, right? Like you said about the number system.
Yeah. I mean, every year there's remarkable archaeological discoveries that help us to understand the Bible and also confirm parts of it. There was a while where people didn't think King David was a historical figure, and now we have proof that he is.
Or even if the Israelites were real.
That was a big thing for a while. People didn't even believe the Israelites existed.
Yeah.
But now we have at least 2 archaeological discoveries demonstrating that Israel existed, and they existed as a people group.
I'll say this. It seems like it's easier nowadays to believe in the Bible than before, because now we have better proof. I mean, you'd think that, with all our modern technology and what have you, it would, make it easier to disprove the Bible if you could disprove it,
Right.
But it doesn't seem like anybody's been able to. So
Right.
I'm just throwing that out there,
I mean, no one's been able to disprove it?
Right.
That's interesting.
I think, but I mean,
disprove what though?
The factual things they talk about in the Bible.
Oh, you don't think anyone's?
I thought.
Well, we just hit a really dirty topic.
Great.
Yeah, I mean whether or not there are factual discrepancies within the Bible. Is that what you're suggesting? That no one's done that before?
I don't know what I'm saying. Okay.
That is an episode for another time.
I'm just saying, whenever you look at like modern archaeological, what have you, it always seems to support what they were talking about in the Bible instead of go against it.
I can't say that I agree with that opinion.
Okay.
I would love for that to be accurate.
And
maybe we'll dedicate a whole episode to looking over some of the archaeological data.
I mean, at least that's what I've read.
Right.
So.
Well, there are certainly books that.
Of course, I've read the books you told me to. So.
Right.
So I don't know why you don't agree with me.
Well, there's a lot of great books on the biblical archaeology, but to date, what we have from the last 50 years, the archaeology has shifted from confirming the Bible to really calling into question a lot of things.
Well, I disagree with that.
Yeah, that's okay. We can go over some of the stuff. Guys like Israel Finkelstein and some of the other. William Devers has written extensively on the archaeology in a way that normal people can understand. So certainly we'll want to look at least Finkelstein and Devers and take a look at that.
I only had to reread his book like 3 times to understand it. So
right.
That's pretty good for me.
We'll read the others 4 or 5 times, see what happens.
Yeah.
All right. If you have any questions or comments, make sure and put them below. Certainly, any questions that we didn't think of, submit them, and we'll see if we can come up with some questionable answers for them.
Sounds great. Yeah.
Fantastic. Like and subscribe.
Yeah.